So if there's any willow tits round about, we might get them going a bit closer, hopefully, we'll see.
We're in one of the last strongholds of an animal that's already disappeared from much of the UK.
Oh. Birds. It looks like another great tit, but I'm not sure actually.
Not a willow tit then?
To monitor and count the birds, the nets are up. The first to be untangled is a blue tit, taken to the hide to be measured, ringed and released.
64 wing. It's in good condition.
But it's the willow tits we're looking for.
OK, we'll let this bird go.
OK.
Ready?
They're charming, they're endearing, they inhabit places that, you know, people see as wastelands, and they're a real kind of iconic species for this area of the world.
Sophie's job is to try and save the willow tit. It's our most under threat native bird, with numbers down more than 90% in the last half a century. The planned HS2 route is a couple of miles from this reserve near Barnsley. Other sites where the willow tit survives are closer still. What are your worries?
Extinction is a real possibility. Willow tits need damp, scrubby young woodland, and this is often seen as wasteland and of very little conservation value.
A report out today claims to show the full environmental impact of the proposed HS2 route. It warns 108 ancient woodlands would be affected, and that in all, more than 600 wildlife sites across England will be damaged, including sites of special scientific interest and wildlife refuges that are protected by law. As well as the willow tit, the report says many of Britain's best loved and most endangered species will be threatened. Creatures like barn owls, hedgehogs, the water vole, white-clawed crayfish and harvest mice. We've travelled south to Nottinghamshire. This river will go under where the Leeds branch of HS2 goes over.
The scale of the impact of HS2 is unprecedented environmental damage, and when you put it into the context of losing places like this that are really valuable, floodplain meadows, wonderful for a whole range of species, and you think about that in the whole scale of England, then you get a real sense that government need to be thinking much bigger and better about what they do for nature.
I mean, they say they're going to plant trees, they're going to have a green corridor going up alongside HS2. Is that not good enough?
It's not. We want them to be much more ambitious, and we want the government to stop and rethink this project and really take the natural world into account.
According to HS2, the figures in today's report are overstated and inaccurate. They say the new line will come with an unprecedented programme of habitat creation.
So here we'll be looking at viaducts somewhere in the region of 20 metres above ground level, towering way over the top of these trees and running all the way
But
through.
promises of new green spaces aren't winning over people we met at a country park on the outskirts of Leeds.
The only environmental mitigation that we're likely to see here is that if a pond is removed, a pond is put in somewhere else. And if a 50, 60-year-old oak is cut down, a tree is planted somewhere else.
Yeah. It needs to be accountable and relevant to the communities that it's going through, and it needs to involve them in how it works. And at the moment you've got a scheme which is created by mandarins in Whitehall, and the communities are seen as sort of collateral damage.
Right now, HS2 is under review. Its supporters say it'll take cars off the roads and cut air travel. Its haters say it's a waste of many billions. But for some, as we battle a climate crisis, the financial cost is not the biggest factor.
Well, joining me now are environmental campaigner Chris Packham and Director of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, Henry Morrison. Thanks for coming on, both of you. Let me start with you, Henry. I guess the problem with HS2 is it's such a long project. It's so drawn out that issues catch up with you, like the fact that we're now much more worried about the planet than we were when the project started.
I think the key answer to that is that, Matt, the reality is we are in a climate crisis. And here in the Northern Powerhouse, we're absolutely committed to dealing with those environmental challenges as well as to rebalance the economy. And if you were to do the alternatives to HS2, so that's to build more motorways, more roads, they generate, even with electric vehicles because of HEVs, significantly more carbon. And what HS2 will do is take cars and lorries off the roads, help us to reduce the amount of carbon we're emitting from our transport. Because people like Chris and other environmentalists need to recognise that road projects are going to do a lot more damage if we have to go to more roads to get people around the north and the Midlands than HS2 will do. And this scheme has been optimised to an absolute nth degree to mitigate the environmental impact.
Okay.
I think that we need to do the same on all the major infrastructure projects in the UK, because I think that HS2 compares very favourably on that score.
All right, Chris, this is getting people out of their cars and out of their lorries perhaps and onto the trains, which are much better for the environment. Your response?
Well, that's the spin that is presented, but unfortunately when you look into the detail of HS2 and what it will facilitate, it's not that at all. It's a project that won't be carbon neutral for many decades. It's a project which is designed to enhance airport expansion. And whilst we clearly have to invest in sustainable green infrastructure and an improved rail network, there's no ambiguity about that at all, this is not a project that's been designed with that in mind. And I think that comes back to your original point. This is an old idea with old technologies which are out of date. Our government has declared a climate and environment emergency, and therefore we think that this project needs to be rethought. We need to rethink HS2 to make it compatible with our contemporary targets.
But one of the reasons why it's so expensive is precisely, apparently, because of the measures they've taken, like digging a tunnel under the Chilterns to protect them.
No, I think that one of the reasons why it's so expensive is that this was designed to be a very high-speed rail network. The speed has been decreased. The capacity to carry passengers has been decreased. The efficacy of the whole thing has been decreased, whilst the environmental damage continues to escalate. Now, we've heard in your report about how wildlife will be impacted, but what we've got to think is that projects of this scale are having a global impact. And Henry would have been watching the television, watching Australia burn, watching Indonesia flood, hearing your weather report at the top of the programme, which has told us that we've had the consistently highest levels of temperature here in the UK throughout last year, and particularly in December. The climate crisis is coming home, and it's going to bring a crisis to bear on the UK.
Okay.
We have a responsibility and an obligation to make sure that this project is rethought with the environment critically in mind. It's not just about cost, it's about the reality of tomorrow.
Let's give Henry a chance to respond. Isn't the simple truth nowadays, in the year 2020, that there are simply issues that are more important than industrial growth, and the climate and our planet are two of them? Hello? Yeah, hello? Yeah, Henry, I think we've lost your audio. Sadly, we've lost the audio. We'll try and get back to you in a second. Chris, let me turn to you then while we try and fix the line. I mean, are you then saying, let me turn the question around, are you effectively saying that any kind of industrial growth that involves infrastructure projects is going to be off the table in the near future?
No, not at all. I think if HS2 were offering realistic mitigation, then we would be far more content as conservationists and environmentalists. But the mitigation that has been offered is, well, frankly, in contemporary terms, it's embarrassing. It's absolutely embarrassing. You know, there is no point in thinking that you can offer to plant 7 million saplings, little sprigs of trees this big, which will probably, the vast majority of which will never reach maturity, to replace ancient woodland.
Okay.
It's just not on the table.
Chris, I think we've got Henry back on the line. Henry, let me ask your response to that then. It's embarrassing, your mitigation.
Yeah. It's not embarrassing. So I care about ancient woodland, but less than 1/10,000th of the UK's ancient woodland is going to be impacted by HS2. And so I'm afraid the report today from the Wildlife Trust, as it was said in the package, is flagrantly alarmist. It gets all the figures wrong. And HS2 Limited actually are not necessarily can be defended on everything, and the project has got more expensive. But the reason for that, as was alluded to in your questions to Chris, is because they've done everything they can to minimise the impact on the environment. By ripping up this project and instead, for instance, expanding existing rail routes, many of those, like the one I'm standing in front of now, border onto other wildlife areas. And so actually expanding the rail network's existing routes rather than building a new one would have a higher wildlife impact. So I think Chris needs to stop being so alarmist. and understand that we have got a climate crisis. I absolutely want to address that crisis, but we also need to deal with the huge regional inequalities in this country, which are behind so many of the challenges that we face in our society. And if we're going to do that whilst we address the climate crisis, we need to build HS2, we need to build Northern Powerhouse Rail, and both major political parties need to understand that that is the only way that we can address both our environmental and our massive economic challenges is by doing it.
OK, gentlemen, we've run out of time, and I apologise for the line issues early on. Henry Morrison, Chris Packham, thank you very much indeed.